Hi everyone. I'm David. I was a strategist at Animal Think Tank, but no longer, and just in between jobs at the moment. So this presentation is based on research I did as part of my role on the Grand Objective Strategic Milestone project that Animal Think Tank was undertaking at the time. So a lot of this work is sort of channeling both my learnings at ATT and sort of the collective wisdom of ATT. I'm hoping that will shine through in this presentation. Just before we do start, just before we start the coffee, that's right. Just a warning, this presentation does include depictions of slavery, and some images might be upsetting, and some descriptions of violence as well, but in a very general sense, so just FYI. Okay, cool, let's get into it. So why look to abolitionism? So it's often seen as the closest historical parallel to our movement. So both involve the fight against the poverty status, exploitation, and othering of individuals. It's also just quite an interesting movement to learn from. However, there are important distinctions when we're trying to apply this to our own movement. And so the purpose of this presentation is to outline the similarities and differences between this movement and ours, and draw away some high-level takeaways that we can sort of apply in our own context. And so I just want to start with a quote from Olaudah Equiano. He was a co-founder of the Sons of Africa, an advocacy organisation at the time, and an ex-slave. And this quote in particular speaks to this emphasis on freedom, which obviously resonates with our movement very deeply as well. So yeah, just a good quote to sort of highlight why we look to this. Here are the contents. So I'll just start with a very brief history of UK slavery, and then I'll go into the UK abolitionist movement. Then we'll look at some key similarities, some key differences, and then we'll end on some key takeaways. Okay, so a brief history of UK slavery. So slavery existed pre-Roman times. It was a fact of life, and tribes, societies regularly enslaved one another. With the Roman conquest beginning in 43 AD, it became like supercharged and institutionalized across the UK, over the bits they controlled. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the Anglo-Saxons continued slavery, but with the conquest of England by William the Conqueror in 1066, slavery sort of transformed into serfdom, which isn't much better. It's basically slavery tied to the land, or they did distinctions. And so, but by the time of the 12th century, slavery as we know it didn't really exist in the UK anymore. It was largely replaced by serfdom. That's until we get to the Atlantic slave trade. So I'm sure most people are very familiar with this, or maybe not, that's okay. So this is from the late 1700s, and what would happen is slavers would take manufactured goods to Africa. They would exchange those goods for slaves, take the slaves to the West Indies, to the Americas, and then bring tobacco, cotton, and sugar back to Europe. And so the first trade of slaves in Britain began in the 1550s, and it was commissioned by Elizabeth I, so it coincided with the beginnings of the British Empire. And there was a few reasons why Britain participated in the slave trade. So one was it was driven by racist justifications that white people were naturally superior to black people, and black people were more naturally suited to slavery. There was also the British Empire demanded the trade in valuable goods, these cotton, tobacco, sugar, to expand its empire. There were arguments that Africans enslaved one another, African tribes, nations enslaved one another, and gave their own people to the slavers, therefore it's okay for us to participate in it. And there was also a religious angle. So it was seen as bringing slaves into Christianity, and it was good for the souls of the slaves. And so the Church of England was very heavily involved in slavery. And in the 1700s, slavery accounted for around 11% of the British Empire's total revenue. And so it was a big part of the empire. Okay, so that's sort of a very brief history of slavery in the UK. Let me take a drink. So looking at the UK abolitionist history, so it's quite a big. Usually it's people think it's around 50 years that slavery was abolished, but the history of abolitionism was a lot longer than that. So the Quakers, so this is the Quaker relief symbol, they were the first advocates against slavery, and the Baptist movement in the 1750s and 1760s also began to speak out against slavery. In the 1760s and the 1770s, you began to see freedom suits. So this is where slaves would sue for their freedom with the help of abolitionist lawyers, most notably James Somerset. And that's set the precedent in England that once you're in British soil, you can't be a slave. It didn't actually stop slavery, it just set like a legal precedent. So that was an important milestone. But the movement really grew with a foundation of the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade. They look the long names, there's quite a few of them, in 1787, as well as other organisations such as the Sons of Africa, led by Oliver Equiano and Ottavaro Ogano, both ex-slaves. And so that that image there is the Wedgwood medallion. At the time, this was a very popular symbol of abolitionism for a few reasons. One, it's sort of supplication to God. In a very Christian society, this was seen as, it was sort of supplication to Christianity, appeal to that Christian sense of helping others, charity. And also there's a racial element as well, a black person kneeling to a white person to save them. And so, and there's also sort of an appeal to universal humanity or male humanity. So am I not a man and a brother? Obviously now looking at it, it's quite a racist symbol, but this was a very popular abolitionist symbol at the time. And the movement can be seen as two phases. So that we're going to focus on here. One is the abolition of the slave trade from 1787 to 1807, and then the sort of the quiet years in between, leading up to 1823, which is when they pushed for the total abolition of slavery. So this first phase is just the slave trade, not slavery entirely. And that lasted until 1833, when they passed an act of parliament banning slavery throughout the empire, although with some caveats as we'll get to later. So let's have a look at this first bit of the movement. So these are two figures in the original society, and the reason these were Anglicans, and the original society was mostly Quakers, and they recruited these two to be more the public faces because Anglicans would be respected in British society at the time, and the Quakers were kind of seen as too radical and odd. And why did they go for the slave trade? Well, one, they thought it was more achievable given property rights under English law. So if they went after slavery, it would be seen as threatening the property rights of the slave owners, and it would be seen as too much to go for. So it seemed more achievable to go for the slave trade first. There's also quite a horrific part of slavery in an industry full of horrors, so it's easy to get emotional buy-in from the British public in terms of public opinion against it. And lastly, they thought it would lead to the abolition of slavery entirely. So if you cut off the supply of slaves to the slave colonies, due to the horrific treatment of the slaves and the lack of supply, this would naturally lead to the deterioration of the population, and it would just wither on the vine, is how they put it. So they were really focused on abolishing the slave trade, and although they did a few other sort of initiatives at the time, there was this remarkable focus and dedication on this singular goal, which is an alignment on making sure this happened. So quite incredible to sustain it for that for many years. So what were some key strategies? Well, one was grassroots organising. So Thomas Clarkson went all around the country, setting up local groups, getting petitions signed, gathering witnesses for Parliament. And it was really important in mobilising public opinion against slavery and creating pressure on politicians to act. We also did political lobbying. So it's important to note that William Wilberforce wasn't actually part of the society to end the slave trade, but he was sort of allied with them. So he was sort of the man on the inside, and he was able to leverage his connections with MPs, and he was part of the class, most of them were. He was consistently applying bills to slavery against the slave trade. Like pretty much every year in the beginning of the 1790s, just year after year, abolition goes, abolition, abolition. So really persistent. They also had a winning hearts and minds. So Alda Adriano was an ex-slave who wrote an autobiography, which was really popular at the time because it was the first account of an ex-slave, or one of the first accounts, and so the British public were really interested in this guy and his experience of slavery. But they also enlisted poets to write poems, they produced essays, and they also showed this diagram. So this isn't the exact replication of the diagram, but it's a very close approximation of it. And so it depicts a slave ship and the different layers of how crammed they are within the slave ship. And this was very shocking at the time. This was to the British public, they didn't realise this was going on. And so they showed this to everyday people, but they also showed it to people in nobility. So this was shown to the Tsar of Russia at the time, who was outraged, even though he had basically all his people circling. But this was very shocking at the time. It was a very shocking picture for the time. And other things as well, like the sugar boycott. So they boycotted West Indian sugar many times. And this was particularly important because it allowed women, in a very patriarchal society, to participate in the process. They controlled the food in the household, so it was a way of them participating in ending the slave trade. And there was sort of this belief that they showed the horrors of slavery, if the people were aware of them, then this would turn people against the slave trade. And I think it's very similar to how our movement tries to bring visibility of suffering and the conditions of animals in everyday life. So yeah, just trying to highlight how we use that, how in everyday use would enable suffering. So all these efforts led to the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, and these are for a few reasons, not all of them. So one was war with Napoleon. So the French actually abolished slavery in the 1790s in their colonies, but Napoleon reinstated slavery after he came to power. So ending the slave trade in Britain would stick it to the French and show moral superiority to them. They had also built up a number of sympathetic MPs who would vote against ending the slave trade. They had also built up a lot of public support for ending the slave trade. And also Haiti became independent in 1790, and Haiti was a massive sugar producing colony. And so there was an argument that we needed to participate in the slave trade to keep a competitive advantage over the French. And so when they became independent, which I believe is the first ex-slave state, at least in the colonial period, to become independent, it removed a major that sugar production from the French, and therefore it was a lot easier to justify ending the slave trade. So that leads on to 1807. They passed a bill in Parliament to end the slave trade, and there was little action until the 1820s. Again, they assumed ending the slave trade would end slavery. It didn't. Some welfare reforms happened during this time. So there was efforts to promote slave-free commerce with Africa. There were campaigns to halt other nations engaging in the slave trade. There was also things like the Slave Registration Act, which was to keep records of all the slaves, so we could keep an eye on, are they engaging in illegal trading with slaves, other nations, engaging in illegal trading of slaves. But the abolitionists kind of grew tired of waiting for slavery to end. Welfare reforms were not being enforced or leading to substantial change. The society reformed in 1823 as the Anti-Slavery Society. And so they kind of followed the same playbook as the first phase of the movement. A lot of local groups campaigning, public demonstrations, petitions. There was even listing that MPs felt a sympathy or willingness to support abolitionism, which for the time was very radical. Like now you can get sort of MP voting records and what they voted for, what they haven't. But at the time, this was, very targeted, very pioneering tools for civil society. And they also reactivated the old network, which had been established in the first part of the movement, to come back in the second phase, which led up to the abolition of slavery in 1833. But let's just look at a few key elements of this later period. So one important element is there were a lot of slave rebellions during the 1820s, and we were really pivotal in helping slavery come to an end. So one in particular was the Sam Sharp Rebellion in Jamaica in 1831. It's also called the Baptist War because the slaves organised in Baptist groups and Bible groups. And what happened during this war is the slavers and the planter class blamed the missionaries who tended to slaves on the island, and they attacked them. The missionaries went back home, they were kicked out of Jamaica, and the British public were outraged. They weren't outraged at the hundreds of slaves who were killed, they were outraged that the poor men of God had been attacked. So, and this kind of undercut the image of the planters as these sort of gentlemen. They were sort of seen as gentleman figures, but this sort of undercut that image. And these slave rebellions in Haiti and Guyana and Jamaica, what they showed was that slaves were not going to be, they would just keep fighting for their freedom, and they weren't going to stop, and slavery just was not a sustainable practice for them to keep going. Women during this period kept abolitionism alive. So this is the Wedgwood Medallion book to women instead. So about 70 women's groups sprang up advocating for abolition during this time. And in particular, women were really important in this conflict between gradual and immediate abolitionism. So gradual abolitionists, sort of the old guard in the first phase of the movement, they thought it was more politically feasible to push for gradual abolitionism because it's more politically feasible, they would be able to gradually the slaves into Christianity, and there was a fear that pushing too hard would undo the progress that they've won. Whereas the women and the younger men were more radical, and they were pushing for immediate abolitionism. So Elizabeth Howard wrote this very influential pamphlet called Immediate Not Gradual Abolition, and this was a big sort of big splash in the movement, and it was really pivotal in pushing the movement towards immediatism. And yeah, the women's groups, as I said, were generally more radical. They stopped buying any products using West Indian sugar, so not just boycotting sugar, but all the products, and they also withheld donations from the anti-slavery society itself until they went to immediatism. And they were mostly funded the movement, so it was a big impact. And so, yeah, it was eventually abandoned because that was for a few reasons. The colonial reforms were not being enforced. Slave rebellions made it unsustainable to keep going slavery. Public opinion was coalescing more and more that this is a moral crisis and we need to do something about it. And yeah, I'll go on to the next slide in a minute, but there was also this broader desire for reform at the time. So, it was the undergoing the Industrial Revolution. There was calls for prison reform, labour reform, child reform, amongst others. And particularly important was the removal of rotten boroughs. So rotten boroughs were parliamentary constituencies where a landowner could represent like 5 people in parliament. And it just so happened that all these landowners who had the rotten boroughs were mostly slaveholders. So once these were gotten rid of during the Reform Act, it removed a lot of that opposition in Parliament from the slave class. And so, yeah, they managed to get it passed in 1833 by an Act of Parliament. But it was ultimately a compromise, and to enable this to be passed, what they had to do was pay off the slavers and the landowners, plantation owners. And we only paid off this debt, I think, in 2017. So the debt that we had paid was being paid to descendants of the slaveholders a few years ago. That's how much it was. It was a lot of money. So yeah, that's kind of the history. Right. So now I want to look at some key similarities and some key differences. I touched on some already, but I just want to highlight something here before we go into takeaways. So one thing is the power of vested interests and lobbies. So this guy is Bannister Tarleton, who was a major pro-slavery advocate at the time. But there were also many others. So British merchants threatened to take their businesses elsewhere if the slave trade was abolished. There was humane washing, so slaves would rejoice to fall into the hands of slavers. They weren't quite as hard as they were an argument. The West India lobby, the slave lobby, they outspent the abolitionists by a lot. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So with newspaper articles, essays, etc. And so it's very similar to some of the lobbies we're facing today. Farming lobby, for instance, where we generally have more money and influence in power, etc. Yeah, it was primarily an Allied movement, although this is some caveats. So whilst there were some ex-slaves like Oliver Equiano and Mary Prince, another ex-slave who also wrote an autobiography, who were able to represent the lived experience of slaves, it was mostly an Allied movement of middle to upper class gentlemen and gentlewomen. So although they organised and sort of gained support amongst the working class as well, but I say with caveats because I think you also need to see the slaves who rose up as part of the movement as well, and so it wasn't entirely an Allied movement, but the movement in the UK was primarily an Allied movement. And then, of course, the gradual versus immediate emancipation very much mirrors the welfare versus abolition debates and all on that. Yeah. But what's the key differences? So, the speciesism barrier. So, although there was dehumanisation and racism towards slaves and black people, there were less barriers to empathy. So, some black people were military veterans, like British Empire was a big place. They would come to Britain after their service, and some of them became homeless, and so there were charity drives to help British military veterans. Ex-slaves like Oliver Equiano, Mary Prince, they could speak about the horrors of slavery and connect with the British public. And there was also a thing called naval impressment. So the British Empire was big. You needed a big navy to maintain it. And for a big navy, you need a lot of people. And so to get a lot of people, they would send, the navy would send gangs of sailors, mainly around the coast. And they would either forcibly just kidnap you off the street, and you're in the navy, or they would buy you a drink. They would put a shilling in your drink, and you would drink it with them, or pally, and then you take in the king's shilling to drink the drink, and then they can kidnap you and take you to the Royal Navy. So the Royal Navy was a terrible place to be. It was really strict discipline, really horrible conditions. You didn't really want to be part of the Royal Navy unless you could help it. And so, in a way, the British public, especially on the coast, had an idea of what it meant to be arbitrarily confined and taken away, because that's what they lived with, in a sense. So there was less barriers to empathy and sort of identifying with people that would be slaves, where I think nowadays we don't really have something as stark as that. Although, there are efforts to understand animal language, so there are efforts, of course, but yeah. The novelty of civic tools is important. So the petitions at the time were mainly the domain of upper class gentlemen and presenting it to other members of parliament. But at the time, they were getting, in a population of 10 million, one of their petitions got 300,000 people. So it was no internet, no phones, and it was an amazing achievement. And also boycotts. So boycott comes from Captain Charles Boycott, who was a British landowner in Ireland in the 1880s, and his workers withdrew their labour and boycotted him because he was addicting other labourers. And that's where the term boycott comes from that guy. They were doing boycotts before boycotts were a thing, before even boycotts were called boycotts. So it was very pioneering tools of civic society, and it worked because these were very novel and, cutting edge. Nowadays, you can get an email with 10 petitions a day. You don't have that same function. There was also the binding of collective faith. Like Tom Harris made a really good argument about this as well, but getting ahead of myself a little bit. I'll explain it. So Christianity was a unifying force at the time. The majority of the population was Christian. And abolition was mostly driven by the sense of religious duty and conviction. And it's very arguably different with our context. I don't think we're a post-slavery society by any means for a few reasons. But the appeal of veganism doesn't have that collective, although there are efforts to, with Andrew Lindsay, with Animals and Faith, but we don't have that thing to tap into this binding ideology that was so emotive and so powerful anymore. It's more, vegan animal lovers kind of constrained that. So I think that's also something that's a massive difference between that times that we were able to tap into faith and this binding ideology almost. And then also this is just, I've talked about a few of these issues. These are just a few of the historical, geopolitical, social context at the time, and I've spoken to a lot of these. But I'll just, this one here, for instance, like India had risen as a profitable part of the empire, and a reason for that was even though they did use some slaves, they also mostly used wage laborers. And Adam Smith had published The Wealth of Nations in the late 1700s, which argued for free trade, using wage labor. And it was just seen as more productive and effective. And the East India Company, which controlled India, began to be more profitable than West India. And so, why make people slaves if you just employ them in wage labor? They get paid, they don't rebel as much. It's all good. So it's just stuff like you look at. I sometimes look at movement like how did they not achieve what they achieved and what all this going on, all these factors. But obviously, it's very easy to look at this in hindsight. It's also important, lesson, we need to be attuned with our environment. Companies spend millions, hundreds of millions, maybe more, on their forecasting for this very reason, to be in tune with their environment. Okay, so we're going to takeaways now. I'm going to do this quite quickly. One key takeaway I think is leveraging the inside and outside game within our movement. So the inside game, I don't know how many people are familiar with the term, but it's sort of working within established systems and institutions to influence policy and legislation and organizational decisions from within. Whereas the outside game is more working with the grassroots and grassroots activism, sort of public mobilization to create pressure on power structures to change. And so we saw this in the movement doing very well, in the early movement with Thomas Clarkson sort of organizing the outside game, William Wilberforce was the inside game, and he would translate the public pressure into votes in Parliament and set back so then be able to head into mobilize more public opinion, and it's sort of virtuous circle. And we've seen this, in our own movement with before Charlie and Animal Rising. So, Animal Rising is sort of the outside game, before Charlie's the inside game, challenge the RSPCA short scheme. And so using and put a collaboration between the inside and outside game is really important for the movement and really important for our movement. So the question for me is who are these trusted messengers in the inside game and how can we recruit them? I think Vegan Support the Farm is such a brilliant initiative to really organise and to employ the support. And I think Kerry Waters, the person who is very involved in that, is also now a farmer transition program. Before we were looking at that. So I think that's brilliant. It's a really good work. But I also think we can go further, organising within the support. So civil servants, I saw there was a civil servant talk on this weekend, which is another great opportunity, for also journalists, lawyers, etc. However, this also needs to be balanced with a grassroots network of local groups which can coordinate with the inside game to and create that sort of public opinion and mobilize and work with the inside game. So again, like Project Phoenix, wow, this is incredible. I'm really glad to see this. But other grassroots groups as well. And so, imagining we had a grassroots network which could coordinate and sort of share and leverage that power with the inside game. I think that's really important. We could do a lot stronger as a movement. Not to say that's not already happening. We'll see. Yeah, take an ecosystem approach. So, use anything animal think tank probably know about the ecosystem. It's been bandied around a lot, but the ecosystem approach used to great effect during the movement. So, talk about winning hearts and minds, political lobbying, grassroots organising. But there was also legal precedents, there was creation of alternatives. So they tried to set up a colony in Sierra Leone of ex-slaves. It didn't work out, but things don't always work out. But they didn't take one approach to change, and they were working with different theories, different approaches to change, and they were sort of using them to add up to the greater sum of the whole. It's a lot more resilient as well. If something failed, like creating alternatives, doesn't mean the whole movement's gone. And so the ecosystem is resilient. And you do see it in our movement. We've got different parts of the movement fulfilling different roles in the ecosystem. And things like VARC, for instance, are great. I think this is part of allowing the ecosystem to meet and coordinate and collaborate. I think it could go further though. So for instance, there's a grassroots group that I'm adjacent to, not really part of, but what they've done is they're creating a charter for collaboration between non-profits and grassroots groups, sort of a code of conduct of how we can work better. And I think stuff like that is really good. I think we need more of this, working within the ecosystem and kind of formalizing how can we work better together. So investing in movement infrastructure is also a really important part of this. So local group networks, resource hubs, narrative movement training, more alignment on long-term strategy, sharing that long-term strategy would be really important. So it's how can we strengthen our movement so no one acts in isolation of the others. It's kind of a big takeaway from me. This is a bit controversial, and it needs a bit of hacking. So religious duty, empathy, and outrage, rather than the idea of social and physical equality for slaves and equal equality, motivated people to act for slaves. So William Wilberforce, everyone thinks great guy, right? He pushed for the abolition of slavery. He's instrumental. Yeah, he's a great guy. When he would have black people around for dinner, he would have white people there. He would put the screen between them, because he didn't believe that black people were equal to white people. So even this guy, who's one of the main movers of the movement at that time, didn't believe in full physical and social equality. And so whilst the movement did work to transform and organize and mobilize public opinion against slavery, it also met people where they were, and they weren't trying to change necessarily the entire worldview to do so. So they were appealing to the sense of Christianity, they were appealing to British pride, etc. And I think Tom Harris said this recently in one of his talks. I swear I wrote my takeaways before this, because I'm going to be referencing a lot of what people said during his thoughts. But it's sort of it's a very high bar to enter into our movement. It's very high bar to be vegan, to change, to care for animals, very high bar. And so, is there some more low-hanging fruit we could go to meet people where they are? So again, Wayne sort of touched on this point yesterday in his talk, I don't know into it, but there are so many communities of animal companions in the UK who are vegan, and who probably don't have any particular affinity for animal vegan or really would understand, or maybe not wouldn't know what you meant by that. But my colleague Milan mentioned is that they would be really behind initiatives like banning fireworks, for instance, and that's just a very low hanging fruit that you could probably organise and get people participating in, and without having to help them become vegan and go the whole 9 yards. And then of course want to work up from that. But yeah, dogs in particular, dogs and cats and animal companions, I've always thought they're a really big emotional pull for people, although you've got to be careful about the charismatic animals focus. So that's one. This is another one I sort of adapted from a report that I'll list at the end. But these big major institutional wins are possible. I think, I look at them banning the slave trade, and I feel inspired that they were able to achieve something so monumental. So, the abolitionists, they weren't wrong to target the slave trade. It didn't lead to the end of slavery. What they were wrong to do, and what they should have done, is followed it up. They just assumed, we've done it now. Job's done. It'll go and do its thing. But it was really brilliant to target the slave trade for a few reasons. So one, it was a major part of the industry. There was massive blow to the industry to stop the slave trade. Although they did start treating their slaves better once they stopped the slave trade, and encouraging them to, have children. But it also enabled a network of local groups and strategic capacity to be built, and it was achievable behind the British public to push for further abolitionism when it came. And so, although gradualism was abandoned, this was a really important first step for the movement and did a lot of good for the movement, as well as, help the slaves themselves. And so, you've got what's sort of the equivalent for the animal freedom movement? Well, the direct equivalent would be if we banned, say, importing animal products, but that's quite a big thing, right? To ban all imported animal products. But could low welfare imports be more achievable? Maybe have the right framing in order for that to happen. Maybe there's an increase in homegrown animal exploitation. But there's also perhaps other low-hanging fruits such as piglet thumping or cow-calf separation, which would be more achievable. So it's just, to me it gives me a lot of hope that big change can happen, and within our movement too. And then my final takeaway, kind of like a somber note. So there's this image of, you see it in some mainstream opinions of the abolition of slavery, is this idea of Britain, white men freeing the slaves and being very self-congratulatory about it. So after the abolition of slavery, there was still a grace period in which slaves were still apprentices. It's still slaves for like 5 years. Slavery still existed in parts of the empire, and we continued to profit from slave-grown goods such as cotton. And although the anti-slavery society still exists today did advocate for slaves after the end of slavery, it would be hundreds of years, 100 plus years before there was even some semblance of equal social, political equality under law. Never mind actually in society, Black Lives Matter still today, and not to mention all the colonial exploitation that also happened. And so, yes, they stopped slavery, the end of the slave trade, they stopped slavery, but what comes next? And that wasn't really thought about. And I think when we're looking at our movement, if we truly believe that animal freedom is a possibility, and we think it's realistic, we need to be thinking about what that actually looks like. And so there was a question the other day about, I think, was it in the keynotes talk about, in the face of climate collapse, what should we do with this limit? And that's really valid. There's like climate collapse, there's geopolitical conflict, there's growing authoritarianism, there's all these scary things that are happening that are really pushing our movement. But if we believe that animal freedom is a real possibility, and I'd like to think that everyone in this room thinks it's a real possibility, otherwise what the hell are we doing here? It may take a while. And so we really need to be thinking about what is our long-term vision for animals. And we need to be thinking, what are the second and third order effects of animal freedom? And what do we want to see in a world that animals are free for them and for us? Excellent. So, oh, brilliant. I'll take it. Thank you. Okay, great. So that's the talk. Right, so here are the main sources. There's a lot of others, but I particularly recommend reading this report. It's absolutely fantastic. Like, there are so many more insights applied to the animal farming movement. And specifically, I should have mentioned it's from the Sentiments Institute. I'd also really recommend the book Bury the Change, which is what a lot of this content is from. Absolutely fantastic book about the abolition of slavery and the others of it. Question time? Yeah, sweet. Oh, sorry.
No, that's fine. Yeah. We'll do that again. Do keep submitting your questions and voting on them, even though it changes the order of the questions, which gets quite confusing for knowing which one's been read. Thank you for that talk, David. That was really interesting. The first question is, looking back at abolition, did welfare reforms play a key role, and is this now seen as a good or bad thing?
I think they didn't play as much of a key role, but part of that is I think they weren't very enforced very well, because at the time the colonial legislators had a lot of autonomy to ignore laws from the British Parliament. And so if you don't have an enforcement mechanism to enforce those welfare reforms, then it's not going to work, right? But also you've got to see the context of, they didn't really see that welfare reforms were necessarily going to be the thing that was going to end slavery. They thought ending the slave trade would end the slavery. So they weren't really focused too much on the reform part of it, because they thought they'd already achieved the thing that was going to do it. So they kind of just sort of brushed their hands and were like, well, we can sit back now and it will do its thing. So yeah, it's sort of a difference between our movement and that movement. It's just the context they were operating in changed what they thought was possible and what needed to be done. Yeah, it's hard to say. Could it have been more effective with more enforcement, with more pushes? There was some really good reforms. Like one was they put in a bill to try and stop French ships engaging in the slave trade during the Napoleonic War, and basically all the slaves were like, oh, this is going to be used to, I can't remember exactly, but it was going to be used to target their own. It would eventually lead to the slave trade being abolished in the first place. So they were able to sneak it in under the guise of sort of screwing the French over again. And so, yeah, but it's hard to say really, because it would require a different context to say whether it would have worked or not. Hopefully that answers the question.
Next question, how much does the layer of speciesism impede moral progress? So often any analogy to slavery or the Holocaust, when talking about the animal movement, is met with sort of accusations of moral equivalence between humans and animals, to say that humans and animals aren't equal morally, so therefore this sort of discussion is invalid. That sort of
So it's not about saying like the exact systems are the same, that they are different in history, context, etc. But what I think is important when you're trying to draw comparisons is you're looking at structural and strategic similarities between the two, and using that to draw how does power work, how movements grow, how the public reacts, how the public, I could have done this about a lot of movements, and it's kind of, we want to learn from past movements, we want to learn from other social movements to inform our own. And so I think that's an important part that we want to be learning from other movements. Whether or not speciesism is a barrier to moral progress, well, I think it is a barrier. Like, as I said, it's much easier to identify with people who can talk, who can tell their stories in a way that we just can't with animals as much. And there's always going to be a bit of a, like, the philosopher Bernard Williams called it the human relativism. He sort of said there's always this sort of gap between us and other animals, other species. So I think that is a big part that we need to overcome, and I think there are some great initiatives. Like, so it's talking about animal speaking, animal talking, and there's a great work by, I can't remember exactly the name or the book, so it's not really useful, but the Eva something, who's done a lot of work on interspecies dialogue and how we can learn from the language of others, and I think those sort of efforts can go a long way to helping overcome that barrier a bit more. As long as loads of other narrative work. I mean, I don't think I've worked a lot on this on the narrative side. Again, hopefully.
And this question is just shot into third place, but are things like banning fireworks really helpful to the overall cause and what we are trying to achieve? I believe in pulling the low-hanging fruit, but how do we decide what is and isn't worthwhile?
Well, so you could go away of what reduces the most suffering, right? That's like a totally valid approach. Or you could use a lot of different different sort of ways of measuring what's important and what's not. The way I approach it, I come from like a social movement theory perspective. So I'm evaluating it on a few different things, like what is something that can get a lot of people involved, what can shift public opinion, what meets people where they are, what could build capacity, like what could I get people organized around this? Could I get them into groups and care about this issue? Could we frame it in a good, in a way that's appealing? So it may not be, it's just a possibility. It may not be the thing, but I'm looking at what are the sort of things we can do that can catalyze a mass movement for animals, or to organize on a grassroots level using, community organizing, buildings on local issues, for instance, that would build a movement of people ready to act and invite more people into the movement. So yeah, I'm looking at it from a perspective of I want to build a movement, and I'm sort of coming at it with that perspective. And so it may, I think this is where the ecosystem comes in as well, though, because there's a role for that, and that could be a priority for that part of the ecosystem. But then, another part of the ecosystem could be working on other priorities, and it's not to say that we all have to be working on the same priorities. Different groups will have different priorities that they want to work on, and that's okay. We need to, we're hitting these different ways of change. So yeah, that would be my response.
Next question is, you've spoken quite a bit about public outrage. Do you see this as an essential tool for social movements to win? And how do you think the animal movement is doing at creating outrage?
Yes, public outrage or public opinion is important. The degree to which you need public opinion is debatable, but I think it was, we've looked at animal think tanks, some studies which say you only need 3 to 4% or something very small percentage of a population to actually care about an issue and take action for non-violent. This is in the context of non-violent civil disobedience to actually work. So public opinion. Sorry, what was the second part of that question? Oh yeah. So yeah, public opinion is really important. You want, because you go through the public opinion, you're mobilizing public opinion. You want to create what's called trigger events. So trigger events, I did have a slide on this, but I ultimately got rid of it. But trigger events are events which dramatize a problem in a new light and bring a new perspective that sort of shifts public opinion on an issue. And sometimes those trigger events are, they're not made, they're not created. So, for instance, the Arab Spring was caused by the lighting of someone self-immolated themselves, and that caused the Arab Spring, and that was a trigger event. It dramatized this public and social inequality in a new light and suppression, or the suppression of it. So you want to be able to, but you can also create trigger events by sort of, I think in the civil rights movement, for instance, when they were doing the March on Birmingham, they knew they were going to get that reaction from Bull Connor in Birmingham. They knew they were going to get the dogs settling the fire hoses. So they were trying to do that so that they would get public opinion on side. And the key part of that is polarization. I'm going social movement theory here, but it's polarization. So polarization is part of making change. Some people will be on board, some people will be against. But the end is sort of creating a synthesis of because the people that are on board, you can use them and organize them and get them into the movement. The animal movement itself, I think there's been some really good opportunities recently. However, I think there's been some capitalization on them, but not so much. So, the horse racing, for instance, I thought that was a great trigger event when Animal Rising stormed the Grand National. I was in York at the time, and I was in a art gallery, and there was a guy who worked there, and he just, he was working there, and he was like, oh yeah, I used to watch the horse racing. He was just talking to his mate. He was like, oh yeah, I used to watch the horse racing, but it's really bad, isn't it, actually seeing the horse racing and seeing them go on the field and that. And So he was talking that term, like spoke through to someone and turned their opinion against horse racing in a way that if you had just protested and just written placard, probably wouldn't have done. Not to say that's not always useful, but I don't know if we really capitalised that in much, or it was really it could have been a bit. We could have, maybe the movement like coalesced around that and started organising around it, and if there was sort of more done on that issue. But then we had like the For Charlie campaign, which I thought was good. We were organising on that and with the RSPCA short scheme. So, but again, I think it needs more people. It needs the whole movement needs to be able to react and respond to these events, these public polarisation, and act as a collective whole. And I think again, this is why we need a strong grassroots group, a network who can be leveraged and mobilised, and you can generate a lot of power that way. So yeah, we need that infrastructure. We need the groups, and we need more of everything. Yeah, that's it.
We've got about 3 minutes, so time for a couple more questions. Knowing what you know about the success of other movements, what one thing would you make our movement do to increase our chances of success?
Yeah, Jesus. yeah. One thing. That's a hard question. I don't know if there's one thing. To me, again, I'll just keep talking about it. I think we do need this more connected, strong, a network approach to movement building, and to have this where we're leveraging all the different parts of the movement to the maximum effect, and that includes some alignment on sort of long-term strategy or sharing strategies or working together and having more. It doesn't mean like we have to do just one goal like the movement did. I don't think that's realistic for our movement. I don't think we can just have one goal. But I think, having a sort of network approach and more strategic alignment on shared strategy would be the one thing. Because when you're working together, you're strong, and when you're aligned, you're strong, and when you're not, you're not. Yeah, there's so many different things.
There's a great answer. It's like one thing to do all the things, but at the same time, no, great answer. So probably last question here. I heard previously that slave owners were paid out during the abolition of slavery. Do you think similar economics will play a part in the end of animal farming?
Yeah, well, this is, we paid them off, and I'm hoping in our case it's not, because what I would like to see instead is we support farmers to transition out of the industry, and we provide them with financial, logistical, whatever they need support, like social support, because it's going to be difficult. There's probably there's probably a cultural pressure in there as well. So there's other layers to transitioning out of farming that probably play out. I don't have a huge amount of experience in this. I'm just sort of guessing. But it shouldn't just be like I'm hoping it won't just be we pay people off and that's the way we get out of this. But again, looking at a long-term vision, what are the second-order effects? What are the third-order effects? We want to have, what we're really aiming for then is sort of a wholesale societal change, and that needs to be reflected at a systems level rather than just like we pay people off, because that's not actually changing things structurally for the long term. We need to be working with these people and helping them transition and all the things that come along with that. So that would be my answer, is to take like a systems approach to it, not just to pay people. I don't know if that's
we're at time, so just before we give David another round of applause, because that was really interesting. Okay.